You read it just as I wrote it. Absolutely perfect. What they didn't tell you is that the person they actually invited couldn't come, so then I was their second person, so I'm honored. And I should also let you know, being the honorable ODK member that I am, one who's true to values and principles, is that I had 2 bags of chips. Just full confession. I was tempted to get a second cookie, but I guarded my temptation. Thank you very much, Dr. Singer. Thank you so much, Dr. Holloway, for inviting me. I'm very honored to be a part of this forum and to be able to share some experiences and reflections about leadership, having myself been a member of ODK, once an ODK member, always one, and being a part of this very august circle. I once had the privilege of working at the White House, and once a week I had the opportunity, and it is quite a privilege, to go into the Oval Office and to brief the president for 20 minutes. And just when you walk through those doors, there's a light, this illumination that fills the entire space. And you're in awe. And over the mantle is the Gilbert Stuart painting of George Washington. And to your left is a very important painting of Abraham Lincoln. And I could just do a surround tour of the Oval Office with you right now. A bust of Winston Churchill given by the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And in the middle of the room is a carpet. And the carpet has the symbol of the United States, the eagle with his outstretched arms. And all around you are these symbols and these wonderful reminders of America and its founding. And about 8 months before the Afghan elections, Condoleezza Rice, who was not Secretary of State, but was National Security Advisor at the time, had invited a delegation of Afghan women to the White House. And she was walking them through the White House, giving them a tour. And one of the presidential aides, a friend of mine, went up to Dr. Rice and whispered to her. And she then turned to all of the women who were part of this delegation, head covered, very much in awe of being in the White House, their first time to Washington, D.C., their first time in America. And Dr. Rice looks at them and says, "The President of the United States would like to meet you." And they were all taken aback. The President of the United States wants to meet us? And as they made their way to the Oval Office, in total astonishment, the President, the leader of the free world, the most important person in the world, wants to meet us. And they came into the Oval Office, and the head of the delegation, so overcome with emotion, looked at the president, and breaking that reverential silence that you have when you go in, you just want to be silent and you just want to take it in, because it embodies all the hopes and aspirations of an entire nation, this one room. And she said, "Mr. President, I'm speechless. I don't know what to say." And the president turned to her and he said, "When you elect your citizens 8 months before the election, remember that the office is always much larger than the man or woman who occupies the seat. And when you build your government, remember that there are principles and ideals and aspirations that should transcend time, politics, and people. Principles and people define our lives. Like the principles that a young man at age 22 etched out on a piece of paper early one morning, struggling with the preamble, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And he actually wrote life, liberty, and property. And Benjamin Franklin took his ink pen and he struck through the word property, because property was something that you could obtain, but the pursuit of happiness is a journey of enlightenment. And so most of us have been shaped by principles that are probably not as grandiose as the Declaration of Independence. Some everyday principles of what to do, what's right, what's wrong. And people who are equally as influential as a president of the United States. I want to tell you about 2 or 3 individuals that have shaped my own sense of leadership, and 1 or 2 experiences that have informed my own way of thinking about my responsibility as a leader. So I'll tell you the story. Abraham Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation. You could imagine what a life-changing moment that was, not only for a country, but for a particular group of people. 1880, a group of freed slaves with nothing except the shirts on their back, their dreams and aspirations, having been owned all of their lives, now having the opportunity to own their own destinies, set out on a great American pursuit. My grandfather's grandfather was one of those slaves in 1880 who decided that they would form a pack, 7 of them, 7 families, that wanted to discover for themselves what it meant to live into the promise of America. And what did they do? They purchased a plantation in Montgomery, Alabama. It's the first record that we have of a group of freed slaves pooling together resources and buying a plantation in the South. And they acquired this plantation, they cleared the acreage, and they worked really hard until they could acquire more land on the adjoining plantations, and they decided that they would create a community for freed slaves. All their dreams and all their hopes and all their aspirations of what it could be like to be an American was now fully realized in this acquisition. And there, in the brightness of an early morning in April on the altar of nature, they made a covenant to one another that we're all in this together. And perhaps they had read Thomas Jefferson's words about life, liberty, and that pursuit of happiness. Or maybe theirs was a foreshadowing of what Martin Luther King would later one day exclaim in his letter to the Birmingham jail, that we're all a part of an inescapable network of mutuality, that we're tied in a single garment of destiny, and that what it impacts one person impacts all of us. And so there, in that little place, in evidence of God's grace, my grandfather's grandfather, John Wesley Motley, having been given his name by his own owners and masters, named his grandson, George Washington Motley, to remind him of his own birthright as a citizen of this great country. And my grandfather has 2 memories about visiting his grandfather on this plantation when he was a little boy in the 1920s. That it was a shotgun house. It was a very primitive house. There were 2 doors. There was a back door and a front door and 3 rooms, and they were consecutive. And there was nothing fancy or ornamented. But he remembers that over the front door was a cross that his grandfather had shaped with his own hands. A reminder that he was created by a God who ordained all things. And over the back door was a picture of Abraham Lincoln, the great American emancipator. He had torn it from a newspaper and framed it himself with twigs. And in his coming and in his going, he was reminded of those inalienable rights that are given to you by a God who superintends all things, and by an individual who was empowered by his own pursuit of happiness to realize his responsibility to society. So why do I tell you that story? Why have I become so preoccupied with that one story that I would write about it? Because George Washington Motley chose to become my grandfather. You see, in that very small community, the families of those founders remained. And one day, a neighbor asked George and his wife, Mamie, to come over for a cup of tea. And they went over, and the Perrys had about 14 kids, and everyone in Madison Park were poor. And the Perrys were really, really struggling. And they asked George and his wife a question of a lifetime. You see, Bernice had just discovered that she was dying of cancer and that she only had about 6 months left to live. And they asked the Motleys if they would consider adopting one of their 14 kids. Now, how you choose which one of the 14 to surrender, I know not. But they chose a little girl who was 9 years old. And all of a sudden, she is transported into the Motley's household. Separated from her 13 siblings, for the first time having shoes of her own, being able to enjoy 3 courses during dinner, and enjoying the freedom and liberation of a large space. And then, as nature would have it, she became 19 years of age, and she met a guy in high school, and, well, the rest is history. They gave birth to a bundle of unformed possibility. That's me. And George and Mamie Motley, now in their mid-50s, having saved up all their retirement money, having adopted a neighbor's child at age 9, found themselves with a newborn in the house. And they adopted me. So let me tell you about my grandparents. George Washington Motley had 3 great desires for this little child. Number 1, that he would realize that he was created by something much larger than himself, that he was no less than the trees and the stars. He had a right to be here, and whether or not he realized it, the world was unfolding just as it should. His second great desire was that he realized that he was a part of something much larger than the Motley household of 4, that he was a member of a community that had a rich and historic history and past, that he was an American citizen, and that with those rights came responsibilities, and that this child would also be afforded the gift of education, enlightenment. And so their pursuit was that someone in this family, someone in this community, would one day be able to go to college. And they invited the entire community to participate in this great American enterprise of raising this child. So let me tell you about a lady named Emma Madison Bell. Emma Madison Bell was already in her 80s when I came to know her. She was muscular in physique and in principle, and she was a great-granddaughter of Eli Madison, the founder of Madison Park. She was a retired teacher and had been retired already for 55 years. In Madison Park, I was known as the Duke, the designated university kid. You know, my grandmother could be in the grocery store and she would see some guy with a University of Wisconsin sweatshirt on, and she would go up to him and she would say, "Excuse me, my grandchild, I want him to go to college. So could you talk to him about the University of Wisconsin?" And the guy's like, "Ma'am, I got this at a yard sale. I didn't even go to high school. Just make it up." And so everybody in this community wanted me to realize my potential and the aspirations that were afforded through an education. And I was known as Duke. And even some call me Little Einstein. And then I made it to first grade. And I was doing pretty good. And then one day the teacher wrote a note home to my grandparents informing them that Eric Motley, who was in the Rabbits reading group, the accelerated reading group, had been demoted to the Turtles. And my grandmother got the note, and you have to understand, my grandmother is not one to discriminate. She likes rabbits, she likes turtles. But she read the note, and she became greatly alarmed, because at peril was not only their aspirations for this little child, but an entire community that was rooting behind him. She phoned Aunt Shine, Emma Madison Bell. And the next thing I knew, Aunt Shine was in the kitchen, and she asked that I be excused, and I heard deliberations. And then I kept hearing her say, "We believe in resurrection. We believe in resurrection." And I kept thinking, oh my God, I went to Sunday school before resurrections or crucifixions. Oh my God, what's going to happen here? And they called me back in, and Aunt Shine said, "You will be restored back to rabbit status." A couple of Sundays later, sitting in church on the front pew next to my grandparents, the minister acknowledged that Aunt Shine wanted to make an announcement. It was like a public service announcement. She comes to the front of the congregation, she looks over everyone, and she says to them, "Brothers and sisters, we got a problem here. Our designated university kid last week was demoted from the rabbits to the turtles." And there was this collective gasp. But we believe in resurrection, and we're going to restore him back to rabbit status. Amen, sister. Back to rabbit status. But it requires all of us working together. And so there are two things that are going to take place. I'm going to tutor Eric Motley, but I need all of you to help me to build a library at his house. So whatever reading matter you have at your house, I want you to bring it by the Motley's household this afternoon. And I'm going to be on the front porch with his grandparents, and I'm going to collect it. And that afternoon, you would have thought a paper drive was taking place. People brought whatever they had. A 1945 almanac predicting weather for that year. A 1972 Jet magazine. Volume L of Encyclopedia Britannica. Anything you want to know about anything that begins with L, I'm your guy. And then someone brought a wonderful volume of English verse. No cover, no table of contents, no index, but richly sewn with the verse of Shakespeare and Keats and Yeats and Byron and Shelley and Wordsworth. And my grandfather asked me to turn to the first page and to read the first poem. There was a time when meadow, grove, and stream, and every common sight to meet it seem, apparelled in the freshness of a dream, as it were, it is no more. The rainbow comes and goes, and lovely is the rose. And this I know where'er I go, that there has passed away a glory from the earth. And every day, for 2 years, Aunt Shine and her 2 sisters, retired teachers themselves, came by the Motley's house and tutored me. And every day we started with my having to stand and recite the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, the preamble to the Constitution, and the Gettysburg Address, and James Weldon Johnson's Lift Every Voice and Sing. Louder. You stand in a place where your grandparents who had nothing came to seek their dreams and their hopes and aspirations. This is your America. You know it. You own it. This is your Declaration of Independence. In this small town, many years later, I discovered after being selected to go to a YMCA program that my grandparents really couldn't afford to drive me twice a week into the city to participate. But for some strange reason, every day that we got in the car on Thursdays to go to the YMCA, the fuel gauge that had been the night before like this was like this. It was not until many years later that I came back from college on spring break that I ran into a local citizen who was always looking for in and out jobs named Nelson. And Nelson said to me, "Hey, do you remember that old man Salary?" "Yeah, I remember old man Salary. He was known as the poorest guy in Madison Park, but he was rich in principle and rich in hopes and aspirations." And then he told me the story that every night prior to my YMCA venture, Alan Salary gave him 50 cents to push his car up our drive, to siphon gas from his car into my grandparents' car so that we would have enough gas to go into the city every day, and another 50 cents to quietly push the car back down the drive. He did it for 1 year, every week. Alan Salary. We would get in the car and my grandmother would say, "Oh my God, it's a miracle. Oh my God, God moves in mysterious ways." My grandfather was like, "I think the fuel gauge is broken." But it was a blessed intervention. Eventually I made it to Sanford. And I met a university president who changed my entire life. His name was Dr. Thomas Quartz. He embodied everything that I wanted in a scholar. He was principled. He was a man of faith. He had studied classical Greek and rhetoric, and he embodied the very ethos of learning. A high school teacher named Joan Watterson was sitting across from him one night at a dinner and sent a note over on the back of a menu saying, "I have a student in my high school Shakespeare class, and his family has no money. They're extremely poor. Can you give him a scholarship to Samford?" And Dr. Quartz wrote on the back of the envelope, "Call my office on Monday morning." And he awarded me an academic scholarship. And my grandfather, when he died, I cleaned out his desk drawer, and there were only a couple of things: a watch that belonged to his father, his little notebook of dimensions when he was building the house, and my acceptance letter to Samford University, allowing me to be the first person in my entire family to ever go to college. Thank you very much. I arrived at Samford, and it was like Napoleon returning back from war. I wanted to take advantage of everything. None of my childhood friends were going off to college, and this was a gift. And I knew that I could take advantage of everything that was offered. I took a lot of classes. I enrolled in everything. I was wonderfully accepted. I was selected to be the president of my class. And then a group of friends one day encouraged me to go through Rush. And I decided, yeah, I go to Rush, Samford, Christian University, all about community. Why not? I didn't think I don't have money for a fraternity, but why not go through Rush? And I go through Rush, and I'm wonderfully celebrated. And then things got kind of serious. And a group of fraternity guys in this particular fraternity really wanted me to join their fraternity. And they pushed, and they pushed. And I found myself on a small slate of people that were going to be voted on one night. Well, it was not until about 10 years later, 15 years later, that I learned the real story of my becoming a member of that fraternity. 3 nights before the vote was to take place, one of the fraternity brothers who was supporting my candidacy came back to his room to find that his roommate was no longer there, that his parents had come while they were at dinner and moved their son from that room. Another classmate and friend of mine was walking through the corridor, and he heard a group of brothers singing to a very familiar tune, a group of lyrics that they had composed around not allowing a nigger to be a part of this group. And that night that they were taking the vote was the same night as the Final Four. And there were 15 students who had somehow gotten tickets to go to the Final Four in another city. And they left 3 hours early and drove back to vote. And they stood in the middle of the room of 200 young men preparing to vote on who to admit into this fraternity. And 7 of them seniors of extraordinary note and fame, one being the quarterback of the football team, stood up before all the brothers and challenged them to do what was right and not to vote against me because of my color, but to vote for me because it was the right thing to do. Many years later, while working at the White House, I went home for Easter break. My grandmother told me that I needed to visit Aunt Shine because she was near the end. I walked into the room, and she was in bed, and it was evident that she was not physically all there. And I stood next to her, very proud. After all, this was the individual who had tutored me back to rabbit status. How could I not feel proud? Aunt Shine, remember me? You taught me the Declaration of Independence. I graduated from Samford. I got a master's and PhD at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. I was asked to tutor William. I am now at the White House. Aunt Shine, you recognize me. Those were the thoughts kind of rambling through my head. And as if she could hear my own inward thinking, she reached out and she grabbed my hand. And she said, "So I assume you think I should be proud of you because you're working at the White House now." I'm not. You see, you're one of the few, one of the select. And that to whom much is given, much is not expected, but much is required. In 1941, there was a great shadow across this country. We were at war. And a young man walking across the campus of Yale University was only 18 years old, and his name was George Herbert Walker Bush. And that day, on December 6, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And walking across campus, he felt so compelled that it was a part of his duty to do something that was much larger than himself. And he went to the registration office and he signed up to go to the Navy without talking to his parents, without talking to his tutors at Yale. And 3 days later, George Herbert Walker Bush went off to fight in the war. We don't have Pearl Harbor before us today, but we do have a crisis of leadership. Today, more than ever, is a great fragmentation in this country, political polarization, cultural confusion. And no one's asking you to go off and sign up to fight in a war. But you are being summoned to realize the better angels of your nature. We are the few. We are the chosen. We're ODKs. And our responsibility is not an expectation, but a responsibility to live in the promise of all those who have come before us. And sure, perhaps the prophet's mantle that to whom much is given, much is required, should inspire us. But we should also realize that we drink from wells we did not dig, and we rest under shade trees we did not plant, and that ours is a very rich and important inheritance. So I've told you about a group of freed slaves who had nothing except dreams and aspirations. I told you about a woman who was a retired teacher who was already in her 80s named Aunt Shine. I told you about the poorest guy in my community named Alan Sowery. I told you about Dr. Quartz, the university president. And I told you about George Herbert Walker Bush as an 18-year-old. What do they have in common? They were all leaders. Leaders who answered to a call. Leaders who wanted to realize that they too had a piece of this great American enterprise. And so they pioneered and they stepped out in great uncertainty and they created a community. And all those people, the descendants of those founders, are still there. The house that I grew up in is a house that my grandfather's grandfather built in 1880. The land that he farmed is a land that my grandfather farmed to put food on our table. Emma Bell answered the call. A teacher who thought a student had the potential of much more. A university president who wanted to help a child realize his dreams and his aspirations. We all have a responsibility. We all have a responsibility to reach the unreachable, to teach the unteachable, and to embrace the rejected. We all have a responsibility because we've been given enormous rights to be a part of something that a lot of people are not a part of. Nationally, globally, in this fraternity of leadership. Reinhold Niebuhr is someone that I have in my office in a frame. He was a great social philosopher, and you'll look at photographs and you'll see Martin Luther King marching next to Reinhold Niebuhr and Rabbi Joshua Heschel. There were three great voices of social conscience. They challenged the moral complacency of a leisure society. And this is what Reinhold Niebuhr said, that should inspire us all. Nothing that is worth doing could be accomplished in a lifetime. Therefore, we're saved by hope. Nothing that is good or beautiful makes complete sense in its immediate context of history. Therefore, we're saved by faith. And nothing, no matter how virtuous, could be accomplished alone. Therefore, we're saved by love. And for me, love is manifested in community. So, maybe Martin Luther King had it right, that we are all a part of an inescapable network of mutuality, that we're all tied in the single garment of destiny, and that what happens to one person on the other side of the globe happens to us deep within our souls. And perhaps now more than ever, we should all ask ourselves the question, who is our neighbor? And what responsibilities do we have to those who look differently than we do, who speak differently than we do, whose own stories are different than our own stories? How do we challenge ourselves as leaders to reach across aisles, to embrace people who are different, and to realize that we actually have more in common than not? One last story. In 2011, while working at the Aspen Institute in Washington, I get a call, and it tells me, the person on the other end of the phone tells me that my grandmother had just died. And I was on the phone with the person, and it was very emotional, as you could imagine. I made it back to Madison Park the next day. I go back to Madison Park, and I'm walking this wonderful piece of land that my ancestors had founded. And all of a sudden, I realized that it was all mine. And I made a very hard decision. We'll all have very hard decisions to make in your lives at some point. What to do with this 2 acres? Would I want to maintain 2 acres of land in Montgomery, Alabama? And so I decided that I would sell the place. And it was really hard emotionally and psychologically. So I called a real estate agent. And the real estate agent showed up at our house, and she sat down with me on the back porch, and she said to me, "Are there any ghosts in this house?" I said, "Not that I've seen, ma'am." "Any spirits?" And I said, "Well, not that I felt, ma'am." And she said, "Well, what I mean is, have anybody died in this house?" And I said, "Well, John Wesley Motley died in this house. James Baptiste Motley died in this house. James Fawcett Motley died in this house. My grandfather almost died in the house, but they got him out. Oh, but my grandmother died 2 weeks ago in this house. Honey, there are ghosts all over this place." And then she told me 2 interesting things. That it was the first time in the history of Motley Drive, where 15 houses were, that a house had ever gone on the market. And the second time in the entire community since 1880 that a house had ever been sold. And the house prior had been sold some 60 years earlier from a brother to a nephew. David Brooks, who writes for the New York Times, is a friend of mine, and he said to me, "Don't you see the power of that? That there are some places in this country where people never leave. They've inherited the land, and the land is passed down from generation to generation. Ours is a rich inheritance, and with the land, and with the people, and with the principles, we're all the richer, and we must preserve it." Thank you very much.